7 board members either at the table, sitting or standing in the room. We have the quorum. So, Mr. Plattenberg.
Thank you, Mr. Moon, Member of the School Board, Dr. Garza. We're here to speak about further continuation and dialogue of the CIP, the Capital Improvement Program. And needless to say, Mr. Sneed's going to go through some, basically we'll be ready to answer any questions you may have. But a lot of the dialogue that we had received, a lot of the feedback that we had received about articulation or fear that the CIP document had been, basically a done deal and the staff's recommendation and so forth was really to reflect a lot of the feedback that we had received, not only from school board members, but also the FPAC and community about having it be more articulate. Well, in the endeavor and our zeal to make it more articulate, we provided some specific examples that people felt were already articulated and vetted that, in fact, hadn't been the actual case. And there were 49 different recommendations that were provided in this CIP, and there could have been as well as 69, 89 more. But it really was to initiate the dialogue. But we heard loud and clear from mostly members of the community, one community in particular that came out and spoke to this. And we have some modified language that we are intending on adding in front of each of the regions. And that language is to read as follows. The recommended boundary adjustment options and program changes that are included in the CIP are for future consideration only. Any option chosen for potential implementation will be discussed and decided through a transparent process that engages the community in accordance with the school board policy and regulations. This includes adjustments needed for the opening of new advanced academic program centers. Now, that language is our draft language to make sure that in each region, when folks look at it, that they recognize that it, in fact, is a working document. It is one to begin conversations. As we talked about in the work session, which a number of folks who were at the public sessions didn't have the opportunity to join us, it really is taking a look at two things at one time, both a short view and a long view. And the long view were to talk about the potential issues to be addressed in certain areas. And the short view really was to look at the potential for one AAP center that had already been discussed and so on. So with that, that sets the basic premise. I don't know if Dr. Garza wanted to add to that a little bit.
Yes, so I actually crafted my comments from the public meeting, the hearing we had, have been and prepared to put those on our website. I know that Mr. Stork may or may not have used those this past weekend. This is a process. This is not yet up for formal approval yet, so we will modify the language to make it more clear that these are a set of recommendation proposals. We will provide links to the board policies that dictate how boundaries must be changed, that process. We also have policies and regulations around the opening of new AAP centers, and there's a whole process also that we're obligated to follow. Jeff and I are also had mentioned earlier this morning that maybe we need to also provide a link as an appendix to the CIP to the November 10th document where all of these recommendations came from. In that work session and many meetings with board members prior to that, and it identified concerns we had throughout and also potential solutions, and it gave a projected timeline. As I look back at that in the CIP, in some cases the timeline was not potentially as clear as we'd like for it to be. So maybe we provide a link to these I thought the staff did a great job on these documents as well. So that's potentially something that we can add.
Mm-hmm. Okay, with that, I'll take comments and questions. I have Mr. Stork and Mrs. Strauss.
Thank you, Mr. Moon, and thank you, Mr. Plattenberg and Dr. Garza. As we all know from our CIP hearing last week, there's a number of members of particularly my community, but I know others that had some questions about the CIP, and in particular, it's what's different this year over past years. And I I deliberately brought, this is a stack of the last 13 years of CIPs here that I've collected, which is maybe a statement more about me or what my home office looks like or something, I don't know. But this year's was very different. And I think, and I will say quickly, I think for a lot of good reasons it was different. I think, and what you'll hear from me now is just I think we went a little bit too far. I think the concept of having a little bit more defined changes in there, or at least directional changes, I think is important to give community and all of us kind of a clearer guidance about where we are going with how we're going to address the overcrowding and the needs of our students. It's where we got to very specific language with specific, what appear to be, in my reading as well, and maybe more importantly the community's reading, specific decisions that are going to be in an official document that is going to get implemented. And I appreciate your comments today and your statement that you read at the CIP last week, Dr. Garza, to clarify that is not the case. I've been holding many meetings to try to help people understand that. And in my office hours on this past Saturday, I have two different sets of office hours. In my morning office hours in the Lorton area, I had about 7 or 8 people asking about Newington Forest and what was happening there because of the elementary school construction and so forth. But in my afternoon hours at the Sherwood Hall Library, I had about 100 people there asking about, again, some more questions about the CIP and the boundary process. And then, as you might imagine, any kind of discussion like this, it goes into the broader issue concern that what's really on people's minds, which is how do I ensure that the quality of the schools in my area and the quality of instruction continues to be, or we can ensure that it is rigorous and top-notch and that my child will get a great education. Because in the end, that's what a lot of that is driven in what we do. But the other thing that's fairly unique to, I'll say unique to the Fort Hunt community, and I know it's not unique in our system because it's happened to others too, but particularly in our community, and I know it seems hard to believe, but it is what is the history there, is that about 30 years ago, we closed a high school, Fort Hunt High School, and I can't tell you how many people brought that up to me and say, okay, in their eyes, at least this is deja vu all over again, meaning that they're doing something to us that we're not involved with, we're not aware of, we're not engaged with. And I obviously have reassured them that we've spent the last couple years talking about that. Mr. Plattenberg, Mr. Sneed, and particularly you and I have, and Ms. Dearna Koufax and many others, we've spent time talking about that. The issues that this particular CIP got ahead of the discussion that's coming for them, and that is in fact discussion in merely a formal boundary study that's coming for them. So I really needed to kind of say that up front just to make sure that we all recognize that that is in fact the direction that we're going, and that absolutely positively that the transparent, comprehensive community engagement over our boundaries and our programs and so forth that are related to capacity issues will be happening. Again, we're looking at an early March time is what I understand. We're going to, and Dr. Garza identified for me that by the end of January we would have a formal schedule. I know that we need ahead of that, and this is something I wanted to ask you all about as well, is that we have to have, per our policies and regulations, we have to have a scoping review, and the board needs to approve the scope of that particular study. And I would urge us, and I would ask you all if you kind of have a sense of when you'll be presenting the scope of that Richmond Highway Corridor study to the board, so the board can have new business and actually act on it. I guess we can probably approve it in a work session. I don't think it has to be in a formal meeting, but we have to, per our regulations and per our policies, we have to approve what the scope of that is. And we do that, in my eyes, and frankly, I was one of the ones who initiated that we do this about 10 years ago, is that we take staff out of the middle of this. We basically, the board is telling staff, here's what we say the scope of this particular study is. So when you're challenged, why was XYZ school not included, or why was ABC school included, you can at least reference the fact that we had the scope and the board made a decision about what the scope of this study should be. So any sense of the timing for that scope at this point in time that the board would be looking at?
Yeah, Mr. Stork, that was one of the things that we've been working with FPAC on, and I know we're in the development of working with them, even though we had a meeting that was canceled. But really to look at getting out in March, I believe, was what they had initially talked with us about. We've got a couple different iterations of previous communication plans that we want to share. I know they've got a subcommittee that is planning on that outreach so that we can get community input, feedback for the purpose of coming back and making a recommendation of the scope. It is a lengthy process. I mean, it is something that does take amount of time to go ahead and elicit enough feedback on possibilities and variabilities to make sure that we can give more of a cogent and informed recommendation for board consideration.
I know FPAC has spent actually a couple of years doing it. They've had meetings in our community, and I know that, again, so hopefully they can move that along. I think it's important given, I know a lot of this is truly a domino that needs to be addressed because we've already done Woodlawn in terms of its under construction renovation, but we have many others that are kind of waiting and I know are in process that we need to have some sense of what those schools sizes and designs need to be, and I don't see any way of approving any kind of construction contract until we have a sense of what those of what that should look like, and that's going to take community engagement and really discussion to kind of narrow that into something that we think will be a final agreement. If you have anything else to add to that, I don't. It sounds like to me I'm a little nervous now about the March timeframe. If that's a realistic timeframe.
Sure. We've already the FPAC representative and I have already, and Ms. Hogan, hi Karen, have already began discussing getting ready for the scope. I think that you have a unique opportunity because you have so many projects which are
It's fabulous. It
occurring
is wonderful.
concurrently, and we have a lot of things to work out. As you mentioned, later this spring, March, April, we have to prepare the bond packet for the county for the fall referendum. Presently, when I developed those projects, meaning the ones that are in planning, I had to pick some type of capacity. It was all based on their 5-year highest projected enrollment. So there are rooms at those schools. The biggest reticence for me, not just putting the dollars together, is planning right now, spending money on planning if I had to make significant changes, because that would cost. It could be, a few $100,000, depending on the scale. So I think that if we entered in and looked at all of these schools, we would have to factor somewhat how large I've already designed them. I mean, there's one that's, pretty big. We know which one that is. But I think that we need to involve all of the schools down there if we're going to do this and be as comprehensive as possible. And Mr. Stork, you and I have discussed, we have a lot of boundaries that are a little bit, they're kind of old legacy boundaries. Doesn't mean anything's going to change. I mean, we certainly can't do that on our own. But I do think we have to have a comprehensive look. And I'd like to do that this spring.
So you're still, in general, you're on target for March, April kind of
Correct.
engagement. You're still on. Okay. Great.
Once Karen and Chad and I meet, we'll have a better idea. Debbie Tyler and I are going to meet with the principals in that area in the near future as well, so we'll have a perspective from the principals. And we're trying to be as comprehensive as we can.
Great, thank you. And just to echo, I mean, it is truly a multi-generational opportunity for us along the Richmond Highway Corridor with the number of facilities that we have. I mean, there's 7 facilities at a minimum, potentially 8 that will get done. I mean, I guess if you add in Fort Belvoir, you could actually make it 9 facilities that are going to be either new or renovated over the next 5 or 6 years, and that's going to totally reset the whole community. And that's part of what I'm hearing in terms of the angst of the community is what that means for the longer term. And I appreciate the language that you read at the beginning, Mr. Plattenberg, about, or at least reference at the beginning, about the CIP intending to be more of a guidance, these are options that we're looking at. The second part that was I also saw in what you all posted, you had a piece, the last sentence I think about, you're talking about advanced academic program centers, and you're talking about new centers. I would also urge you to adjust the language at least slightly in there to indicate that there could be significant changes in a center. For example, Stratford Landing, if that center, which has grown dramatically over the last 4 or 5 years, if that center were to be changed, and it's clearly one of the options under discussion, then I support us having that part of our discussion. If that were to change, then just referencing the fact that that would be clearly done as part of a study, an overall study, and the reference in there. So new as well as significant changes would be, I would urge you to include that language so that the community can see that and know and take, I guess, solace in the fact that we're not going to do anything without their full engagement. That would be appreciated.
That's excellent feedback. Yeah, we'll be happy to make that clarification.
And then the last item I had was just the motion language itself. I looked at the historical language, and it's pretty limited, it's essentially 2 lines. And I just want to be sure that whatever language, and I'm not sure who has the lead on proposing the language for the motion for the CIP, that it some way or other reflects reflects what the discussions have been regarding the changes, the adjustments that are being made in the CIP language that's in here. In the past, we had a motion that basically said, you know, it approves, we moved to approve the language that's in the CIP, the summary, and it talked about the narrative. Those are the 2 key wordings pieces that are in there. And I would just ask that at least that we look at that language this year with the eye towards ensuring that it doesn't commit the board, that it truly commits the board to what, at least what I've always believed we're committing to, which is the dollars and the kind of the queue itself. So I'm throwing that out there. I don't have any specific language to offer, but I'm happy to work with anybody on that just to be sure that there's no misunderstanding on the part of the board when we approve CIP as well as the community what exactly we're approving.
I also want to be clear. I understood your point about what, how we construct the motion or how the motion is constructed. Understood. Our intention is to have this document updated before you all actually act on it. So the final document that you would in the near future potentially adopt would reflect that language, would have actually
what he presented.
Yes,
today.
that's correct. So we're talking about more in general terms today, but it would be updated in the official document that you all would approve at that time, assuming approval.
Okay.
So I just want to be clear about that.
That's very helpful, and the fact that it's in front of each of the regional sections, I think, would further reinforce to anybody who'd review that the language is that of some options and ideas, recommendations, not specific, implementation items. Thank you.
Okay, I have Mr. Strauss and Ms. Evans. I'm hoping to be done by 2:30 for this portion of the work session. Keep that in mind. Mrs. Strauss.
Thank you. Yes, I have some suggestions for changes, particularly in Region 2. First, on the one hand, I'm very pleased that we are beginning to talk about the reopening of some of our older buildings, Pimmit, Lease, Graham Road, et cetera. I think we're finally showing to the community this is beginning to come forward on the horizon. So I'm very pleased to see that. I also am pleased to see that if you actually understand what's coming forward, clearly there will be an attempt to add on to current buildings where appropriate. If we can add some classrooms here or there. In other words, we need to make the best use of the resources we have before we actually go to building a new school. And I think that shows appropriate conscientious use of resources. However, I know that there is a concern in how the language reads for Chesterbrook, Franklin Sherman, and Haycock. And I know that the underlying piece is that we may need to open a second AAP center in the McLean Pyramid, just as we've done at Langley, and that's worked just fine. But the way the language reads right now, I'm finding the community is concerned that we may have single school centers that you will end up without the critical mass. You will not be able to implement the program with fidelity. So, because it's my understanding, the idea is that we may need to open another center with the critical mass, 2 classrooms per grade, so that the program is a real center-based program. But at the same time, acknowledging that we have the ability to add classroom space at Chesterbrook and at Franklin Sherman, and then leave to be determined if we do open another center where that would be located, because I think it's premature. But I think most people can see that we can And I would love to know how many classrooms we can actually add at Chesterbrook. And it's my understanding that Franklin Sherman has much more capacity potential over time. There's just more ground space there. So,
Well, I
Mr.
know
Sneed.
from considering I've renovated both the buildings, I would
Right.
much rather at Franklin Sherman
Right.
because Chesterbrook is it's a big
I know,
drop-off
it's a
hill there.
challenge,
Yes, I don't know that there would be any issue with opening. There's enough mass in the McLean Pyramid to
yes,
open a second.
there is. But it needs to be
AAP
located
center.
probably in one place and
Right.
indicate that we're only looking at one center and not two. I
Right.
think
And
that's
you,
what.
and you have a divided cohort in AAP. You have part of the kindergarten students are
Right.
up at Churchill Road. So
Right.
I'm
Yeah,
sure that
if
would
we
be
could
part of
bring
the
them
discussion.
back into the pyramid, but I think it's the acknowledgement they're looking at one additional center, not two, and that when we open a center, enough kids, enough classrooms, fidelity of implementation, and that it would be serving, obviously, be a catchment of more than one
Sure.
school. So if we could change that language. And then the other piece on the boundary change potential between McLean and Langley, again, emphasizing, it's my understanding, and the language is going to be added, we have not determined what that boundary would be like, because I'm already getting some very concerned community members out of some communities that absolutely there's no recommendation to move anybody at this time. Way ahead of the game.
But it does look like we're going to have a little bit of room at Langley at the conclusion
Sure.
of the renovation.
Right.
And again, we were just trying to be conservative because we have limited capital funding to utilize
Right.
some space.
And a boundary change, that's fine. But I just making sure that the community understands there has been no decision as to who or how any of that, because there are many different options. So.
Yeah, we hadn't even got to the McLean part. We were still wrapped up with Route 1. but
Yes, no, I know. But again, it's calming people down, So thank you very much.
Yeah, these boundary processes are so complex and require months of work. And you're right, we haven't gotten to the details of any of them. We just
No.
recognize that down the road,
Exactly.
as has been pointed out to us by FPAC and others, we've got
Sure.
we've got some courageous and very difficult decisions to make ahead
do.
so that we're maximizing our current capacity. But these are decisions that take a lot of time.
Exactly. And
to
there are
fully
always many
implement.
different options when you actually come to the table with the community.
And there's typically a phase-in process that we have to consider so that you're not changing students that are currently attending and that kind of
Right.
thing. I want to go back to AAP centers for just a second.
Right.
We do have another clearly defined process by which we would consider an AAP center. There's a whole engagement process, and it actually has to come to the board, just like a boundary does. It's a separate required action on the part of the board. But we do recognize, as is reflected in the study that was done by George Mason University and others, the critical mass is important. But secondly, we have feeder patterns, pyramids that do not have AAP centers. So we would never open an AAP center that would negatively affect a current AAP center. But we recognize we have some AAP centers with lots and lots and lots of children where, in fact, there's enough critical mass in some particular areas that we could have a strong, viable program and keep students closer, in some cases in their neighborhood school, and keep them in their feeder pattern. Right now, in the absence of that, we have students going outside their feeder pattern for elementary school, in some cases middle school, and then having to come back to their high school. And that's not good. And so down the road, though, we think that those are some changes that we're going to need to
Yes,
make.
yeah. And I agree absolutely with what you're saying. Thank you.
Ms. Evans, to be followed by Mrs. Smith.
Yes, thank you. I will say, as far as the specificity in this new CIP, I do want to say that I value a lot of the specifics in here, and I understand that it's a balance. You know that if you put so many specifics in here, that it gets people upset and making people think that this is going to happen, not options. And I think maybe we just want to make clear that a lot of things that are in here, we're talking about potential solutions, potential options. I would not want to see us go to a situation where it was so general as to be meaningless. So I just wanted to make that point up front, and Mr. Stork and I have talked about that as well. We have talked about the fact that I'm looking in my part of the world at a lot of schools that are very over capacity. And I know in one of our previous conversations, you'd mentioned that some of the worst problems were going to be at the middle school and high school level, that you were seeing some moderation at the elementary school level. At the same time, we got a report from UVA back in the fall saying that the birth rates had gone way up, something like 42% in Northern Virginia from 2008 to last year. And I'm just wondering if you have, is this downward trend, is this just a blip downward, and is it going to skyrocket again, or how are you reading those enrollment and birth rate figures?
Well, actually, our birth rates, and I don't know what's high. I mean, we average about 15,300 or so countywide. We did provide you with birth rate data for each high school pyramid. Yeah, it was posted to Board Docs.
Oh.
So here's one of the things, and we pointed this out when we had the work session in November. In 2005-06, those students would actually wind up in our schools in 11 and 12. We had 14,682 births and 13,009 kindergarten students. For this school year, which was births in 08-09, we had 15,819, so it's more than 1,000, but we actually had 12,912 students, so we had less kindergartners, even though we had a higher birth rate.
Interesting.
So what we're seeing is the actual trend for the birth decay ratio is declining. It's a little over 5%. And you can see the difficulty that we have is that this data, once we were able to actually have access to it, we're in the midst of a recession where there wasn't a lot of mobility. I mean, home sales. And when you look at these ratios, according to these pyramids, I know that if the ratio is greater than 100, meaning, if you had 100 kids born and you had, the yield's greater than 100, then we had home sales. Well, of course, we don't have access to those home sales. Now, I'm starting to meet with some realtor groups, hopefully, to see whether we can get any type of data to help us predict that. But the other thing that it indicates is, for instance, the Langley Pyramid had a birth decay ratio of 145%. Well, I know that what's happening there is that they're buying homes, right? And that's what's occurring. The same as at Woodson. Did I say something wrong?
No.
Yeah. Oh, all right. So, but we actually are providing the data is here. So the birth rate
I will
is,
definitely look at that. I didn't
and we
realize that had been
actually show
posted.
the birth rate for the next 4 years.
All right.
Well,
And
that's very interesting
it
that
is
it's
very
declining.
static.
My-
It's just static.
Let me interrupt for just a second
Yes, ma'am.
on this specific issue. You all remember that we've hired Edulog, a company, to help us kind of reshape or redefine our methodology around projections. And this team, to the end, have been working very closely with Edulog. They will, we will know very soon when we're going to be in a position to present to the board where we are with that work, but I would imagine in the coming months, because that would be in advance of projections for staffing and getting ready for the next school year. So at some point in the near future, this won't be the last work session we'll have on facilities and planning, and one of those would be in the near term a presentation on our new methodology. How might that change some of our numbers, and we can look at how by school, how that has changed over time. So I think kind of hold that thought. I think in the next few months or so, we'll be in position to have a presentation on that specific topic.
Excellent. I appreciate that.
And just to let everyone know, this is part of the CIP follow-up that was posted to Board Docs today. We apologize. We were supposed to post it Friday, but it did not make it to Board Docs until this morning. But this information is posted as part of the follow-up.
Okay, great. And I do want to ask you about a couple of specific situations. What you heard at the at the hearing, some of my community. Of course, there's a desire, if we can possibly, to get Wilston back for building a school among my community. There are some folks who are concerned about the proposal that's in discussion on the new school on Columbia Pike, and a concern that we've gone farther down the road than I know we are and that you know we are. But I wanted you to outline a little bit what would be required to pursue that, and some clarity on community engagement and how the public can weigh in and express their views one way or the other on that site acquisition and on that proposal and the possibility of a new school on that site.
Okay, so you're talking about Wilson or the Columbia?
I'm talking now about the Columbia Pike potential site.
Well, I mean, there's a couple of ways that we actually obtain property. One is a dedication. Some people would call it a proffer. We have a couple of those sites already built schools on. For instance, McNair or Island Creek, those were sites that were dedicated. I'm sure it was part of the development process for in those particular regions. We used to buy property. We, in fact, beginning in the late 40s, we had a gentleman here retired. Well, he was actually a third party, but he would work with us all probably through the mid 90s. He was buying property all throughout the county. His name was Ed Moore. I suppose that a lot of the sites now probably don't just house schools. There's other county facilities there. I remember, so Ed started at that time, but we haven't been purchasing property because it became so cost prohibitive in the early 90s when that first, when that was probably the second iteration where real estate kind of jumped in the county, and that's why we transitioned to sites that were really dedications or proffers, however you want to look at it. I think that Colin Powell may be a site that was provided to us. The site at Columbia Crossing, and I don't want to, if we, and I think what you're asking is if it was not a dedicated site, as opposed to one, we would not, as staff, we're not able to negotiate for the property. We do not have the ability to buy property. These are all require board actions. So if we were to enter into negotiations with the developer, we could only do so with the approval of the board, which we haven't done that.
And that way you would take it, and that would be another opportunity for the community to weigh in on their
Correct.
views if and when you brought that to us.
Right. I do, I have talked to that community a lot. I know that they are not really in favor of vertical buildings, but I'll tell you this, the Tyson site, which is really the first one that we looked at that was a small site, and which is the genesis of our idea of a vertical school that we would design. That site we have no option. It's a little over 2 acres. I mean, that's as large a building. There's not much I can do. And in fact, the county staff, we've looked at other sites associated with the Silver Line. So there's 2 in Reston, 1 in Herndon, and 1, I guess it's still Herndon, but it's almost to Route 28. And all of those sites were predicated on the fact that we could only build a vertical school because there's just not that much property around. 10, 12 acre sites,
right, and
are
particularly
not that plentiful
in some
anymore.
parts of the area rather than others. I would say that some members of the community don't like the vertical school, but there are others who are very happy with it.
Right.
The Bailey's parents, for example, and the Bailey's students, the ones who are actually using that school, I would say, are very happy with that site. And there are other members of the community as well who may not be as vocal about it, but are supportive of it. So I wouldn't make a general statement from that community that everyone was opposed. But certainly, I know we're looking more and more throughout the county at the possibility of this as the ability to get more 12-acre sites shrinks. Another question that was raised in connection with this was, as we're looking at ed specs, do we have ed specs on a vertical school?
Well, regardless, what we would look at Bailey's was unique because we had
Yes.
to kind of adapt to an
Yes.
existing
You had to
facility.
do that
But
quick,
the
right.
one that we envisioned is 100% compliant with our ed specs. So if you had a gym, it would have, we would probably have a minimum of 18 or 19-foot ceilings. So the amount of volume, that's the height in a room, would be the same. The square footage would be the same. Everything is identical.
So that's the difference between new construction and retrofitting a current existing structure.
And would you say that down the road we would have specific ed specs for a vertical school, or do we need to develop
That's a good
those?
question. I think the biggest challenge that we would have is when we talk about play space, because I'm
Yes.
certain that unless it had such a unique program that we weren't going to offer, didn't include every space, I think that the play field would be probably the biggest,
But
the biggest
spaces,
concern.
spaces like that, Ms. Evans, could be annotations, really, within an educational specification.
Yeah.
The instructional program drives the educational specification, spatial relationships within a facility. So for someone to say, would you want a vertical ed spec? We've got multi-story schools now that we don't have because we have a single floor plan of a school, and we have a different ed spec for a two-level school.
Okay.
It's the ed spec of the instructional spaces to provide the best educational components to it. There could be annotation for certain unique features, and I think that'd be the better way to go.
I see.
That'd be
Okay.
my recommendation.
And I know there are others waiting, so I'll just ask one more questions before waiting for go backs. We have overcrowding, as you know. We're at capacity, soon to be over capacity, both at Glasgow and at Stewart. And I see that our solution for Stewart is to try to get a rezoning to get an addition. I'm not seeing the funding in here. Am I just missing that, or what would we do about the funding? And then secondly, in the meantime, what do we do until we can get zoning and get an addition over there?
Well, the funding, we have this conversation a lot about the renovation queue. New capacity, once we're certain that it's required, in the case of Stewart, once they really, because they're pushing right up to their limit right now.
They sure are. Yeah.
This document is rewritten every year, and it's based on what facts we know. And in this particular case, I think, provided that the students materialize at Stewart, that we would probably reflect an addition there. I mean, the challenge is whether we can actually have the rezoning granted.
And okay.
So that's where what I would be a little bit reticent, because there's a chance that they may not approve it right. In the interim, they're going to have to be treated like any other high school. I mean, we've got a number of schools like West Springfield, Herndon, Oakton that have been 200 students over capacity for 20 years. I mean, they're going to they'll have to receive temporary classrooms so we can get there.
So basically trailers.
Yes, yeah, unfortunately.
And I'll hold off my others for a second.
Okay, thank you for holding up,
Thank you very
Ms.
much.
Evans. Just want to remind board members that I am still hoping to be done by 2:30. And I have Mrs. Smith, Mrs. Schultz, Mr. Welcome, and Mrs. McLaughlin on the list so far. Mrs. Smith.
So, I'm happy to see the information there about the kindergarten enrollment, and since I, heard we're going to talk about it later. My question was, are you seeing it in different parts of the county more, and how does that impact what we do? So I'll hold that for now. One of the things looking in here that gets addressed, and it is a concern of mine with the sizes we build schools related to where we're seeing the projections go. So like pages 48 and 49, it addresses some of those issues and looking at the size of Sandburg. And it's always dangerous to mention other districts when you don't know what's going on, but when you look at the map at page 48, there's room in other schools. Page 55, that's talking about increasing the size of West Springfield, but you see them at 91% capacity. Page 60 references building Rocky Run to 1,350 kids. And, so these are the questions that before we make any decisions, there's need to be answers, especially when we're looking at changing AAP centers and who's in schools. So I guess, a little bit better understanding of how are the decisions getting made for how much capacity we increase at a school compared to some of the programmatic changes and boundary changes.
How are we making the decisions? I wasn't sure if that was, is that the, I mean, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful.
No, I think here's always the issue for the board and the community of when do we get that information of where we are in the process to when decisions are being made. And Kevin, from talking to me, I kind of go crazy when we start building schools over 2,700 kids. And you say, okay, that's where South Lakes is going. And some of these other pieces, and it affects everything. It affects cash flow and how we're doing things. I mean, one of the first things, and I've talked to you about this, is looking at making Rocky Run 1,350 kids when we're looking at maybe adding more AAP centers at the middle school and places. So it's like, how do you figure out what's the timeline for the decision-making to know it's integrated enough to make the right decision?
Yeah, this is a tough one. And, Dan talked about a little bit earlier, I'm just and I'm not trying to diminish myself, but I'm just a simple director here. But but Dan and I have had, and a number of years ago, we discussed these schools, and I wasn't the one driving the bus, and I'm not here. And I know that I've been the director now for, I can't remember, probably 8 or 9 years, and we talked about this in 2006 and 2008 about the size of schools. We will do as we're directed to do. I mean, something, if you look at Rocky Run, that is a programmatic issue, 100%. I mean, if you were to pull, we've got a lot of kids from Stone and other schools in there for AAP. If we were to pull them out, it would definitely affect the size of the facility. But you mentioned South Lakes. I mean, they have a fairly isolated boundary. We've got one, they're adjoining neighborhood school, Herndon, another boundary which abuts that, but they're fairly isolated. I'm not sure that you have a whole lot of options of how to approach it. Rocky Run, I think, is unique because it's programmatically driven as opposed to something that's occurring, within the community. We do have stipulated school sizes, and our elementary is large. It's 950, and this is a policy, I think, is that it's the size of the school. And then we had various sizes listed for the elementaries, but it's really based on the teams. So middle schools, middle schools are team taught, so it was based on the size of the team. You guys if we increase the middle school class size, then that's why it goes from, say, 1,250 to 1,350. The first high school that we actually designed at 2,500, we have 2,000 is what's in the reg. Of course, our average high school is 2,200. Westfield was designed at 2,500, and South County was designed at 2,500. And then we added an addition at Westfield that was 55,000 square feet to drive it to 2,900 students. So when you sit from our perspective, and I'm not being critical, I don't, it's kind of difficult for me to know. All I know is I look at the population and nobody's saying to me, let's change the boundary, And that's, I apologize for that.
May I add
answer.
to this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this was one of the topics of conversation that we haven't delved in deeply enough around, and we said that was on our list of things to talk about.
Correct.
Remember, we have these kind of 2 plans being developed. We're trying to comply with what the county needs for us to do, but we've got all this other development we need to continue to work on. And one thing we do need to spend some time talking about is examining our current standards around school facilities. So your point's well taken, Ms. Smith. For an example, do we renovate real small schools without adding capacity? Okay. We do have one high school in the plan, long-term plan. Is that the direction we're headed? Or are we adding more capacity to other high schools? I mean, so those are things I think we're going to have to take up. It is on our list of other topics to have at work sessions. So I think we do. And, you know, I know that I've had a conversation with some of our board members. Do we want to take into consideration percent poverty in some cases where we can? You know, a school with 90% poverty and they're 1,200, 1,300. You know, I mean, those are just things I think that we need to spend some time delving into a little bit more deeply. It's time for us to re-examine, to your point, Ms. Smith.
And I think that's my takeaway, that it's not straightforward, it's not clear, there's all these pieces that need to be thought of together before we get too far ahead of where the decision is. And with limited resources, there is a responsibility to fill the schools we have before we start to build too much capacity, which isn't always an easy discussion, but all these pieces are there, and we need to ensure that we have everybody together with that. Okay, now, Mr.
May
Moon's
I add
gonna
one more
tell
thing
me-
to this? And this does not, no one's billing Ms. Smith for my time that I'm talking, right? So, I get my own little set of amount of time, right, that I can just sporadically throw in. We're also, kind of as a new strategy, it's reflected here, but we still have a lot of work to do around that, and that is bringing our existing facilities back online as schools. So that is also a part of this conversation, just to add to Ms. Smith's, because some of those are smaller. You know, are we going to have to add capacity to some of those schools as we bring them back online? So there is a lot of that we need to really spend some time on.
So, so some of the, I don't even want to use the word frustration, but it's the first one that came to mind, is we have all these pieces, and we have the discussion about the AAP centers or boundaries. And so it's that understanding of timeline and when these things are going to happen. And, you know, that's one of the things when we first developed FPAC is that, you know, they could look at this overall picture of what we need to do and help with the informing of, okay, you should deal with this hot spot next or that one, because we can't do all these things at once. So we're kind of looking at this document. It doesn't look like much will happen throughout the rest of this year. So when are these things going to start happening? So I think that's something that board members want to hear about. Easy, straightforward question. Page 71 starts the detailed sheets about each of the schools. And one of the things that's listed as capacity enhancements, is that just brick and mortar, or does that include modulars?
No, that could be either a modular addition, which is purchased through the capital
Capital fund,
program, or bricks and mortar. And you notice I don't like to buy modulars anymore. I mean, I figure if we need an addition, we need an addition.
Okay, so then look at Centerville Elementary School, because I think it should have been listed as having a capacity enhancements, because it does have a modular.
Yes, we added that 3 years ago.
Okay, but they're not listed as
Okay.
having a capacity enhancement. That's why I was confused. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, I am still hoping. Mr. Schultz, Mr. Velkov, and Mrs. McLaughlin, Mr. Anna Koufax.
So it's very interesting how we tend to be building on each other today. So where Ms. Smith was going, I think, was something that I'd like to see, that I was hoping to see, or that I'm hoping to see by the time we get final in the CIP, is the connotation of permanent capacity and temporary capacity. You know, I don't hold up other school divisions very often to say, you know, if we could look at what they're doing, but there are practices that are employed by other divisions that are worthy of looking at certain times. And in this case, there is a neighboring school division that has particular aspects of their CIP that I do admire for its ease of use and readability for the general public. And I do think this concept of us capturing what permanent capacity is each year and what represents temporary capacity with temporary facilities is important. And I think that helps inform and educate the public as well. So that's one thing. A second is getting a little bit into what Mr. Stork was discussing, but in a abbreviated fashion. I'm hoping that as opposed to riling individual or causing angst in individual regions, pyramids, neighborhoods, streets, whatever, that we can simply offer at the front of each CIP that the tools available or the options available to the school system and board are as follows to handle capacity needs. And simply list, if you will, a menu. There are boundary changes. There are capacity enhancements. There are temporary facility additions. There are programmatic changes. There are enhancements or changes in placement of programs, so that there is a known and published menu of these are the and or components of how the board and staff address anywhere, not targeted to a neighborhood or targeted to a boundary or anything else, just so it says that at any time this is what's available. And in particular, what I really like, because this is the one paragraph, and I apologize to read this, but and they happen to have a 10-year plan, but the fact that it just says this CIP is not an inventory of all the work that must be performed on school facilities over the next, theirs is 10 years. It is rather a specific budget for the first year, and then they list the fiscal year, combined with more general planning schedule for the 4 additional years, and then an estimate for the additional needs. So there is a wholesale caveat that says we're not telling you that everything here is sacrosanct. What we're saying is this is a planning document. We're basically budgetarily committed, because we commit our capital budget and our operations money, in certain directions a year at a time. But here we are, we're committing to this, and then kind of after that, it's a plan. And population centers may change. Miss Evans may wind up with 5,000 units in her district that we don't know about right now, that may change priorities. And so that there's a fundamental understanding between we who are in charge of the school system and they whose money it is and who we're serving, that this is a plan. So that's another thing, is kind of a wholesale caveat. The third is, Mr. Plattenberg, thank you very much, and Mr. Sneed, thank you very much for bringing up the fact that there are schools that have been waiting 20 plus years, and we do have to, we do have to look at impact. And I don't know how we can capture that if something that we can do can impact, 3,000 students versus 400 students, maybe I don't know what that is, but we're at the point where we've got to talk about where the money goes, in some regard, what if that's like a handicap factor or something. I don't know the answer to that. And Ms. Smith, you brought up the issue of, and you just happened to mention it, Rocky Run. I've got, Dr. Garza, I've got a welling problem, and, my colleagues may have seen, emails about, my end of the county. But between Union Mill and Willow Springs, I've got a pretty serious problem. And Willow Springs is one of those unique situations where it's a feeder to Fairfax, which, we kind of, we've to some degree committed to Fairfax City School Board will pull kids out of that stream. So we've got a problem there. Those kids come from lots of different places because that's an AP center. They feed off of Willow Springs, which feeds Fairfax, and peel off and go to Rocky Run, which feeds Chantilly. And if they aren't in that, that feeder going to Chantilly, and if they don't go to TJ, And if they don't go to Fairfax, they may go someplace like to Centerville. So they've been in multiple pyramids, multiple feeder patterns, and they wind up back at Centerville, and they never attended elementary or middle school with any of those kids. So we have some underlying problems that I don't really see being resolved. There's like hints of resolution, but there are other things here that come into play along with this AAP issue, the feeder pattern issue, capacity issue, and I'm very pleased to hear that we're getting to maybe a standard of an elementary school, because I've long been, a vocal opponent of what I call Costco warehousing, with the kids. When we're getting to 1,000 and 1,200 students in an elementary school, we've gotten off message. And so I'm just wondering, with all of that, we'd look at $11 million for Rocky Run for a renovation. Not that they don't need a renovation, but we're busing 60% of the kids there. And would they be better off having a smaller school that we spend maybe a little bit less to renovate, and now we've got money to do something someplace else, and oh, by the way, we're going to save even more money because we don't transport 60% of the population. So I'm just wondering if you could maybe pick a couple of those things.
The 2 points on what you said, Ms. Schultz, that I'll respond to really quickly, and the rest we'll have to follow up. That was one of the intent of the pyramid-centric, certainly. What you described about students peeling off, not with the cohort groups, that was one of the areas that we talked about in our previous work session. The other thing is that's the beauty of having some of the schools that we have in our arsenal, if you will, as possibilities in the future. And in your case, that's where the Clifton School, even though what you mentioned for a modest amount of upfit, could provide that type of swing. But again, these are all possible plans that would have to be vetted and articulated and discussed. But that's the beauty of, particularly in that region, of not only having land, but also having an existing facility that might be used for that purpose.
Is there a possibility of an inclusion of that, some kind of a caveat that this is, a plan for this year, and then after that? I mean, is that some language that you all would be willing to look at putting in?
Absolutely. I mean, if that's the direction of the body, yeah, we'd be happy to
And
not
then-
only put
and
the
then-
language
and-
in, but then execute it.
And do you just have a quick comment on that permanent capacity and temporary capacity?
In terms of, I think it just provides for exactly what you're talking about, because of the number of, just thinking about it in my mind, the cost of repurposing that facility that's in existence right now, and the number of students would accommodate those that are being peeled off, if my numbers are correct in my head. So I think it would accomplish what you are looking at, but we would have to cost that out and come back with a formal response to that. But I think it's very doable.
Okay, with that, I'm still hoping. Mr. Welcome, Mrs. McLaughlin, Mr. Elena Colfax, and Ms. Hines. That's not counting go backs.
So
Mr. Welcome.
I'm very appreciative that we've added in the specific ideas about how we would solve various problems. This is a step forward. I think it's going to give the public an earlier idea of when something is going to potentially affect their neighborhood. Of course, we've already seen this, it's had this effect, and I appreciate the language that's going to be added, which will clarify that these are possible solutions to these issues, but it's not, that the approval of the document is not going to mean that those things are now approved. So I thank you for that. I have a thought for potentially the next iteration a year from now in the CIP, that we have time periods associated with these things, and I'd kind of like to see a timeline that would show, maybe for some of the biggest issues, sort of when you can expect to see which things addressed. So I just leave that for you as something to think about.
Yeah, we can do that. I'm not sure that I can envision 49 boundary changes happen. I mean, I can certainly do it if I'll release it like a week before the election or something like that. But I can do it. we'll make it like 4 feet.
You got the hook.
I thought you were just a director, simple director.
Okay. I was going to ask a question that I thought was maybe a dumb question, but when I heard the questions raised by Mrs. Smith, I think maybe that it's actually, there's more to this than I thought. My question was going to be, is there value in deciding that we're going to add capacity every time we renovate? And is this a question that really is on that second track, and should I wait until we have a separate discussion for that kind of issue?
No, it's a very good question.
I think that's for a future conversation for our next iteration of our CIP. I think that's a conversation the board does need to have. And it may not be in all cases if the school's already at the standard, whatever the standard is. But if they're well below the standard, I think that's where the question has to be asked, right? If it's a real small school, do we renovate it to a real small number? Or do we say that's our opportunity to use those dollars to add capacity throughout the system?
Right. What prompted my question was a comment that I read in a correspondence with Mrs. Hogan from FPAC about how, we can spend almost $1 billion here over 10 years, and we're going to run out of space if we're not adding capacity. Okay. The other question I had was about a truly comprehensive plan for the Richmond Highway. Is it my understanding here from what I heard that this is something that's a couple of months down the road that this is going to start taking shape, or because I'm seeing a need for sort of understanding all the working pieces for that entire region of the county. Ooh.
I do believe you're going to start to see some type of proposal coming together that's more comprehensive for that area, because we need to get the community engagement process going in order to meet the timelines. So as the team works with FPAC, we are putting together a communication and community engagement plan, but before we get there, as Mr. Stork mentioned earlier, we need to get the scope approved by the school board. So we need to start putting that plan together as to where some of the proposals or recommendations to start getting the community feedback and engagement. So you are going to see something coming together very shortly.
And Mr. Velkoff, in fact, if this timeline wasn't sitting on top of the other work that's been going on, and we would, this has kind of been interjected into our timeline just because it's a predetermined date that we have to comply with. But we are contemplating what could look different in that part of the county, including there is an existing brand new school that had been contemplated. Do we need to use those resources to, for an example, add capacity instead of building a brand new facility? Take those dollars, those resources, and add capacity to other schools. So once there is that community engagement based on what we hear from the community, the next iteration of this plan would most likely be adjusted accordingly.
Real quick, Mr. Moon. So then I'll leave a question in the air, which is, do we want to have our planning document evolve to contain multiple regional plans? I mean, I'm thinking besides the Richmond Highway area, maybe there's going to be a need for sort of a comprehensive plan of the eastern part of Fairfax County, or the northwest part of the county, or the Oakton-Tysons. Do we need to see, in other words, do we need to see these details aggregated up into a larger whole?
And we have looked at it, or we have been thinking about it from that vantage point. I believe FPAC at one time said we just needed to use the nuclear option with regard to our boundaries because we need so much worked on. I totally get it. But we can't have everyone mad at us at the same time. And I don't think we can manage it all at the same time. Because boundaries are no one ever likes boundaries changed because they love the school their children are going to right now, right? But we are thinking about it in that way, taking areas of our county and just strategically going around using the benefit of our FPAC and getting community engagement. But we think that's the best way to look at it. We do agree with that approach.
Thank you. Okay, I'm not much hopeful anymore. Mrs. McLaughlin, Mr. Nanakovic, and Ms. Hines.
I don't think you should be hopeful because one of the things that I think some of us have voiced over time is that this is an extremely important thing that we do. And some of us have said, quite frankly, reviewing the annual CIP could probably require an all-day work session. And so I definitely want to fulfill Mr. Moon's wish, but I also think looking at our agenda, we've got an hour for the charter on FPAC, and I don't think that's going to take an hour, so hopefully we'll still be able to stay on schedule. But I'm in listening again to my colleagues, I will say right off the bat, in case my questions go long and they tune out, and I don't blame them. But this is an example of the fact that this is an enormous county with 191 plus buildings. How do we break this down for the school board to play a vital role in its governance? And I'm teeing up the fact that those of us on the Comprehensive Planning and Development Committee have been talking about the fact that how can you have a school board and not have a school board committee on facilities? I mean, we have FPAC, and that's wonderful. But in the end, this requires board attention. And when I look at the magnitude of the work that Mr. Plattenberg and Kevin are both sitting here now trying to answer all these questions, I have to think that we've got to look at a better way than a couple of hours of firing off questions to you guys in work session. And so with that said, at the macro level, some things that my takeaways are, I continue to worry about the AAP center growth. And for my colleagues, I would like to draw your attention that in the PowerPoint presentation, it said that the net in migration in Fairfax schools from school year 13 to school year 14 was 856 students. Our growth in AAP students that same time period, 500. How do you have a net in migration of 856 students, but you've had 500 student growth in that same year that are being identified for AAP? In my mind, it just doesn't compute. So I think what it does talk about is the fact that as we wrestle with our facilities and we wrestle with having seats in all the right buildings, we heard this during our citizen participation speeches the other night. Being able to look at our program offerings and how that impacts our facilities, we've got to be able to wrestle that one out because clearly, as we heard from the speakers, they are bleeding into one another, and I'm worried in everything that I see. So tagging in on that, I just want to say this for my colleague, Mr. Stork, and his community. I deeply appreciated the tremendous number of speakers who came out. In the end, we are a board, and we all have a responsibility for the school system. So even though that's not my district, it was very meaningful to hear their concerns. And I look forward to supporting my colleague, Mr. Stork, as he works with the superintendent and staff to figure out what to do. But I think that community did an excellent job of just sort of saying to us, hey, this is a really important issue. And we hope that we will be part of the dialogue as you wrestle with it and try to figure it out. So I wanted to make sure that they knew they were heard. In terms of the CIP itself, because Dr. Garza touched on this, and I want to give kudos to my FPAC appointee, Charlie Hookey, who has been there for many years now, and I appreciate his expertise in representing Braddock District. Charlie mentioned that both Montgomery County and Arlington use this type of approach where it's almost like a biannual CIP report. You have sort of a mini financial document that we would produce at this, sort of December, January timeline to be sent over to the Board of Supervisors that provides the minimal, information and language that the Board of Supervisors needs. But then it would give us time to then have a more substantive document that isn't, compressed by the county's demands, but maybe allow us to shape that CIP into what we need it to be on the timeline that works better for us as a district. So I wanted to share that input that I received from him, and I thought that I would welcome hearing from Mr. Plattenberg and Mr. Sneed what you all think about that. And then I wanted to say two other quick things. To the residents in Mason District who came out and spoke about the Wilson site, I was very pleased that they came out and spoke to an important issue. And to my colleague, Ms. Evans, I want to support you in whatever we can do with that as a full board. I think it is absolutely essential, based on the conversation we just had before the lunch break, that this is where joint conversations with the Board of Supervisors and the school board members, when we talk about if the school system is one of the most important things we offer in this county, then we've got to have joint efforts surrounding those kinds of things. And I think that your community has raised some very, very substantive points about the Wilson site. And again, whatever we can do to help on that, but I think we have to be very firm in looking at that. And then, finally, I guess I would just say to the wording in the CIP that I believe Dr. Garza has talked about, that you all began today's meeting trying to allay community concerns about, look, this is what we're laying out, but absolutely we're, going to honor our commitment to be a school system that brings in our community. They're part of the dialogue on any type of boundary changes and things. I want to thank you for really being very clear on that, because I think that helps our community, and it also, I think, helps with the reception of this CIP document that we're about to vote on. So, Mr. Plattenberg, I was just teeing up that one particular question, about doing a CIP in two phases. But I just realized there was one other note I wanted to make. I noticed in the regional summary that as of 2019-20, and the 5-year projections out, that we will have 6 high schools where there's going to be 300 to sometimes, I think I saw one number that was almost. So I just wanted you to know that not only in my district, but just looking at, countywide, I appreciate these here, and I would like to hear from my colleagues, what does this mean? I mean, where are we going to go with this? Because that 5 years is not very far away. And I think, we've been so mindful of the overcrowding at Annandale. We were mindful at Fairfax High School. And now, we're looking at more than, 6 schools that are going to have that problem in spades. So I think that's kind of my second question. If you just speak briefly on.
Okay. Well, Ms. McLaughlin, certainly the whole purpose of the initial discussion and the CIP was to excite engagement in the community, not to incite panic. But that being said, I believe in whatever motivates people to be involved, although the therapy sessions, I'm sure they'll send me the bill, but the point being is I really enjoy community engagement, because it truly shows that when we come together, when we have different ideas from different perspectives, the final recommendation that's provided is not only more founded, but it's more informed. The contextual awareness of communities through those processes that we have, and they're prescribed in policy. I mean, the policies that we have, 8130 and the Reg 8130 and the School Board Regulation 3333, all speak to facility boundaries, but they also speak to AEP centers and when they're overcrowded and when to address additional capacity. In regards to the high school, that's one of the reasons why Mrs. Smith has been asking passionately, as she has, about capacity size, because specifically she's called me on numerous occasions to speak about high school capacity. Mr. Snead does have the capacity addressed in one way, shape, or form, as you heard about the Stewart comment and discussion. But again, it's all part and parcel to those discussions, which leads back to the Arlington approach to giving themselves a breather in between. And what Dr. Garza had brought to a staff saying, you know, we've got all of these complicated issues. And that's kind of why we were paralyzed for almost a year after the Fairfax city boundary adjustment, because there were so many issues in so many different parts of the county and so many passionate concerns that need to be addressed. Mr. Snead is constantly reminding me about the middle school issues that we have, Longfellow, Thoreau, et cetera, Cooper. Those are ones where, for capacity, he feels we need to make sure we make those changes almost immediately. But the opportunity that we have in the Route 1 corridor with projects that are already in design or so many projects going on in one region really kind of trumps or basically juxtaposes the angle as to why we wouldn't want. And I think giving the opportunity for us to work with FPAC to develop community outreach, to get some type of contextual awareness, and perhaps prioritize some of these initiatives and give you the information that you need to make an informed decision. I certainly embrace that concept. There is an element of staff capacity that we have, and I think we've been really, to say we've been drinking through a fire hose is, I know you guys like seeing me and Mr. Snead on a regular basis, but I think somebody mentioned it best. Are we worried about program or are we worried about facilities? But the point is we're worried about all of it. So I do embrace that. In fact, Dr. Garza had brought that up to us as well to find out what exactly we could be turning over to the county versus a full, in-depth, comprehensive plan versus the cash flow and the projects that are currently in the queue.
Great, thank you.
Okay, now I am hopeless. Mr. Narcofax and Ms. Hines.
I'm always so quick. Come on. I want to thank staff, all staff, for the time that you spent working with board members on this. You met with us in groups of 2, in groups of 1, multiple times. I do appreciate that very much, and it happened over the course of many months. And what I want to say is, I think we did struggle for a bit to say, what should this look like after we've come up and we've talked to the staff, we've talked to our board members, what's it going to look like? And, you know, there was a change. And we talked about maybe needing an appetizer menu rather than a blank page as far as changes that will happen. I think, you know, for Region 3, we got a full course dinner. So, and that, you know, it needed to start though. So, and I think what we have here, when you do look at Region 3, you look at it specifically and you see there's 25 schools mentioned, and there's multiple pathways and, you know, crossroads, and there's programmatic changes. But I think at this point, having that information out there in some way is positive. Like you said, whatever it takes to generate public conversation, let's begin. So I think that's where we are right now. I just, again, this is coming from the district perspective, I still am concerned about the number of facilities that would be accommodated with temporary structures. That continues to worry me, particularly in Region 3. So many of those are. And I do think, and this isn't a surprise, I've talked to Dr. Garza and all of you, and many of my colleagues have touched upon it. the need there, I don't think we have the best system, and I will try to provide solutions because I want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. But when we talk about, and it's different in all parts of the county, the need for the programmatic changes that need to occur in one area over another, and how that affects facilities, and how do we bridge that and talk about that together and in a forum. And I think as we go out into the community groups, I think that's going to be something that will just naturally occur. But I do still am concerned about that process in general. But I think it was, in some ways, it was a new approach, and it caused dialogue, and I think that's important. And now we have some things on paper, and we can look toward that as we engage the community and as we look forward. So, I just want to thank you for that, express the two concerns that I have, and let's continue forward.
Well, without repeating, I'll try not to repeat, but thank you. There's a lot of detail for Region 1 as well, which is my area. And I have had questions from constituents, a few, about, well, wait a minute, is this happening in the fall? When, what's the deal? And so it will be very helpful to have that clarifying language. But as Ms. Derenak Kaufax just said, I think signaling to people what's coming, that we've had these conversations, we know where the areas are that need change, and staff working with FPAC and with school board members has come up with some suggestions, not just out of your back pocket, but after a lot of work and thinking about it, that, that the community should be on notice that these conversations are coming. I think that's a good thing. And in fact, Howie Pearlstein, my representative on FPAC, has offered to come out into the community with me and start talking to people about it, which I thank you very much. That's great. I wanted to just quickly follow up on something that Superintendent Garza said. I'm very glad you brought it up because I was thinking of bringing it up myself, and that is how we handle demographics within our schools, and particularly the percentage of FRM, free and reduced meal students in a school. I agree very strongly that we need to talk about that. But I kind of wanted to maybe follow up a little bit with how that would fit into this document, because it seems like, would we be, and again, maybe this is premature, but when you look at this, when we do talk about boundary changes, well, that's where that would happen, right? And of course, we don't control housing patterns, so we are limited in what we can do. But I'm wondering if I guess what I'd like to see us talk about is having either guidance or maybe even some goals within the CIP for not only as we make changes, but that we actually think about making changes to make that happen. So I thought if you had any thoughts.
Those are some philosophical conversations. I we actually stated up front some principles that were guiding principles. I don't know if that was the exact terminology that we used, but essentially it was this: the importance of neighborhood schools, right? There were some others, but the
Right.
Right.
So we talked about pyramid-centric
Yes.
as much as possible. Right.
Now, I do think, and probably it's not for today, because this is a really in-depth, what you're getting into is really, I think where I would suggest we talk about that is, is that our priority, that this is about neighborhood schools? Secondly is, in cases where we can mitigate size because of the high percentage of poverty. I think what you're alluding to is maybe a different conversation, and that has to do with percentage of poverty in a school. I will tell you, when I was a principal, I've had some conversations with our principals about this recently. I think that gets into a little bit dangerous territory, in my view. And having been a principal, and if I were a principal in the school system today, I would say it doesn't matter to me if a student qualifies for free and reduced lunch or not. You send them into my school, I will definitely do everything I can to meet their needs. So, I think that gets into, that creates a whole different panacea in terms of, do we bus students, which is very different than kind of a neighborhood school approach. So, I think that warrants maybe a little bit more lengthy conversation what we have time for today, but I think it's an important conversation.
I agree. Thank you. And I know there's no way that we could talk about it right now, but I think even though it is a difficult conversation, I do think it's one I want us to have. So, and maybe as we talk about the next iteration of this document. So, thank you.
Okay, any other board member before I do go backs? I have 2 board members on go back list. I'm not encouraging any more than that. So with that, I have a Miss Evans and Mr. Stork for short go backs. Thank you.
Thank you, and in hopes of having your hopes and dreams realized, Mr. Moon, I will make 2 comments and ask you 1 question. And one, I appreciate the birth rate data now that I've had an opportunity to look at it. I did just want to make the point, because we talked about the birth rate to kindergarten ratio, and you mentioned that Langley was at 145%. I do think it's important, though, for us to look at the raw numbers, because if you look at there are only 3 high school pyramids where even the enrollment numbers are over 700. The top one being Westfield, the second one being Stewart, and the third one being West Potomac. And so even though their ratios are not high, their numbers are very high, as opposed to some of these with the high ratios but very low numbers. So I just don't want that to get lost, that low ratios can still mean very high numbers in some of our areas. Right, and they do. So that was that comment. In terms of what you're looking at in our area for AAP, I think that as we look at the idea of having the pyramids aligned, where we wanted to go in that direction, I think that it is important to take a look at this document to see what that means in terms of facilities, because it would appear that what we're possibly anticipating over to create an Annandale AAP center would also mean sending students to schools that are already over capacity, and in some cases significantly over, and taking it out of a school that at least is projected to be under. So I think that's something that we have to be very cognizant of as we go down the road with AAP, that we don't want to create a center and then create more overcapacity at a school that's already there. So that was my second comment about it.
Right. We actually, when we talked about creating an AAP center in Annandale, it was in conjunction with a renovation project at either Annandale Terrace or Braddock. So the center the consolidation would only occur at the conclusion of the renovation.
So that would be way down the road, because Annandale Terrace is way down the road.
Braddock or Annandale Terrace are coming up fairly soon.
Okay.
So,
well, I'm glad for that clarification,
so
because that's
all of
a
those
significant thing.
changes would only that we propose for new centers.
Yes.
Was only in conjunction with an existing project that's already named in the CIP.
I see.
Yeah. Right.
That's one of the reasons why you see some that are in there, and people could come up with other creative ideas. We try to make logical connections as to why some were included. Even though out of the 49, I said we could have had 69 or 89.
Right.
Well, the reality is, of the ones we provided, we tried to provide a logical connection from a purely facility standpoint.
Okay. I appreciate that clarification. And then lastly, I would say with our next real problem over in my area is Glen Forest Elementary, which I know you're focused on. And this goes back to the size of an elementary school. That school is already over 1,000 students. However, because we are so limited over there, one of the solutions is to redistrict to other surrounding schools, but we don't have capacity now in surrounding schools. The ones that are next door to Glen Forest are also booked. A question I've had from that community is, have we considered just building an addition and just letting the kids come? And I realize that creates a very large school, but it's a question I was asked, so I'm asking you that if that's something that's been considered, because that's not reflected as a potential option here.
Well, I don't want to say everything that I consider, because I probably wouldn't have a job much longer. But yeah, I have actually contemplated that there. I mean, that school, I think that we're showing them up close to 1,300 students, which would be a pretty
down
big,
the road, yes, and
right.
300 over capacity, right? And that's including, because they've got so many modulars there, so that in some ways underestimates the
Yeah,
capacity
so
issue.
they have a couple of modulars. You would take them, the modulars would be removed, and you would have to build an addition, yes. So I could do, yes, we could build it. I was not planning to propose it.
All right, well, I appreciate that answer. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Stoll, the last one.
Okay, thank you. And just to repeat what you just said about advanced academic program centers, we're talking about you can't move anybody out until you have a place to move them. So folks, particularly at Stratford Landing, who've raised the issues, we're looking at least a couple of years, because even if you made a change there, it would take a couple of years to be able to have the capacity to move them somewhere else, if that were the case. So I have. Thank you. That's what I wanted to hear. Two more things. One is that the preschool plan capacity, are those included with any of the capacity designs that are being done for Richmond Highway Corridor, is to add in preschool ability, because we know that that's one of the things is essential to our future of addressing the needs of the kids there?
This kind of ties into the question that Ms. Smith asked me earlier. We do, if a school, for instance, when we talk about the ed specs, we know what the default spaces are in a school, and if they already have a Head Start or FESAP, then we certainly will renovate or build new. And there have been instances where we've added FESAP or Head Start. We did it at Garfield. They didn't have the spaces, and we added two.
And you and I have talked about Bucknell being, in many ways, an ideal place because it's a walking community and
Right.
has very high poverty and so on. So.
Right, and the biggest key for me is knowing that before I start the design and kind of develop a budget, and that's kind of leads into the question that Ms. Smith asked me too, is knowing what the requirements are. And I
Our
think
plans
that-
to
yeah.
date, though, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Sneed, and certainly Mr. Stork, it looks like you have a good grasp on plans for the last 15 years, maybe 13, 15 years. Just for the communities, for the purpose of the community, our CIPs forever, I think, have never contemplated pre-K
Yes.
capacity.
Right.
That's correct.
Okay? And we need to be clear about that. And that's because our charge from the state has been K through 12. Now, with that said, it's a very significant value and priority of this school system, this board, and this administration. I think I can say that, given our legislative statements and many other documents, that's important to us. But we've been just doing it the best we can, and the county's really got to get behind us to help us get that done. Now down the road, as we work on different kind of more comprehensive looks and different analysis that we would include in our plans in the future, we need to spend some time talking about if that becomes a standard as a part of our official ed specs. I don't know today what kind of impact that would have, but it would have a significant financial impact on our capital improvement plan. So we don't have the answers to that question. I just want to be clear to the community about why pre-K has not been included to date. We've done the very, very best we can, but it's not been. May in the future. I'm not suggesting what's going to happen in the future, but it had been to date.
Deeply appreciate your comments, and that is something that people need to understand. I don't think they understand it well enough. The last thing I'd like to ask you at least to address, and you and I have had conversations about this, is any administrative exceptions in the response, in the response to questions. It references our boundary process for less than 15% or less. Are you aware of any? Obviously, I'm asking specifically about the Richmond Highway area, but in general, I know others might be interested in that.
There is a very specific process in terms of a policy and a regulation around boundary changes. There's also a provision in policy that allows for what we call administrative light change in policy, in a boundary change, and that's really giving the administration the opportunity to do essentially what's considered a cleanup. That's my word, okay? But it's making an adjustment to a boundary where you have a small number of students where it's in the best interest of those students to change their current defined boundary. And there are two that are being contemplated right now in the system. I don't know that either one of them will move forward, but I know that there are two regional assistant superintendents that are looking at very small adjustments, none in the Route 1 corridor area, none, in fact, in any of your magisterial district. And those would be communicated to board members and the community. There's still an engagement of the community that is required.
Yeah.
But I think you wanted me to clarify that. But
I did.
when we're talking about these that are
Yes.
contemplated in this document are comprehensive boundary changes. We're not talking
Yes.
about tweaking to make some adjustment that would work for 10 students or 5 students.
Thank you. You've given me the answer I was looking for. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Welcome.
Mr. Moon, I'll be brief. Since we had the discussion here about FESAP and facilities, it underscores the importance of an integrated plan with the county and what we were talking about earlier. I mean, I'm thinking there's some kind of new construction happening out next to the government center. There's a new government center happening in Providence, and there's one rumored in Mason. And these all seem like opportunities for locating preschool facilities, but I don't know if those conversations ever have an opportunity to happen. So, again, we need to work more closely with the county and take advantage of these opportunities.
Okay, so I'm going to end this work session with one rhetorical comment or question. So this is a 2016-2020 CIP. Do I understand that by year 2020 we'll not have any more trailer being used in Fairfax? Okay, with that, thank you. We'll take a 3-minute break.
And Mr. Plattenberg and Ms. Quinn, you aren't going anywhere. We have FPAC to